Hi there. For over 30 years, Capcom's Street Fighter series has been a juggernaut of the video games industry. 1991's Street Fighter II, in particular, solidified the fundamental concepts of what a fighting game even is, and a lot of that success came not just from innovative game design, but through the panache and style of its iconic, larger-than-life characters. But the glue which kept the art and design in lockstep came from the game's highly memorable and deeply melodic soundtrack. Street Fighter music is a near-endless fount of brilliance, diversity, and most contentiously, evolution and change. We're going to go through that dramatic history, but to keep us somewhat on track, I'm going to be primarily focusing on just a single character's theme, and how her theme reflects broader changes within Street Fighter's long musical history. That's right, we're talking about the kicking queen of fighting games herself, none other than Chun-Li. But before we can talk about Chun-Li, we have to rewind the clock a bit further back. In 1987, Capcom released the original Street Fighter in arcades. While not the first 1v1 fighting game ever made, it still managed to leave its mark on the genre, thanks in part due to the introduction of Ryu and his iconic moveset, such as the Hadouken, Dragon Punch, and Hurricane Kick. But as important as Street Fighter I is to the history of fighting games, it isn't remembered with the same fondness or fervor as the rest of the series. Still, it would be a mistake not to discuss the game's influential original soundtrack. The score for the game was entirely composed by Yoshihiro Sakaguchi, a Capcom employee who primarily worked on sound design and sound programming, but on a rare occasion shifted over to music composition for Street Fighter. His arcade soundtrack for Street Fighter is a product of its time, with harsh, crunchy synths that might sound a little abrasive to a 21st century audience. But even with such steep technological concessions, Sakaguchi's score still laid the groundwork for several series conventions. In Street Fighter, Ryu must travel the world to take on its greatest warriors to ultimately come out on top as they say it, King of the Hill. If the general premise sounds familiar, it's because it's basically the narrative conceit of every mainline Street Fighter title. To match the globe-trotting nature of the game, Yoshihiro Sakaguchi composed a wonderfully diverse score that strives to evoke the many cultures you visit along the way. Ryu's adventures take him to Japan, USA, China, England, and Thailand. Excluding the bonus minigame stages, that makes for 10 discrete levels. For what is otherwise a fairly brisk arcade game, Street Fighter's soundtrack was surprisingly generous. Sakaguchi composed a unique piece for each of the game's stages, which meant each step of your journey was more granularly scored than a lot of its contemporaries. Compare this to Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda, both which came out a year or two apart from Street Fighter. Those were noticeably longer and more ambitious gameplay experiences, but with markedly shorter and thus much more repetitive scores. Say what you will about the quality of the score, but from a quantity standpoint, Street Fighter I is positively decadent and created a gold standard of music to stage ratio that every subsequent game in the series would follow. But since each level represented a different opponent, it meant each stage theme doubled as a character theme. Therefore, each piece of music needed to be emblematic of both the location and the fighter. This is where Sakaguchi's background as a sound designer came in handy. It meant he could twist and modify these simplistic synth tones into believable enough representations of real-world instruments from around the world. There's the driving rhythm of taiko drummers in Retsu's Japan stage, the funky slap bass in Joe's USA stage, the fast rhythmic plucks of a guzheng in Lee's China stage, the church organ virtuoso of Eagle's England stage, and the metallic, atonal hits of a Balinese gamelan in Adon and Sagat's Thailand stages. The variety of tones, melodies, stages, and characters all complement each other to make for an experience that feels like an exotic world tour, or as exotic as a quarter in an arcade cabinet in the mid-80s could get you. Like its accompanying game, it's a score that's definitely shown its age, but by establishing the entire template of what a Street Fighter soundtrack needs to accomplish, its influence on the series is unquestionable. But if Street Fighter was the spark, its 1991 sequel was the bonfire that ignited a revolution. And the same can be said of its soundtrack, which took the template of its predecessor and elevated it to new, next to impossible highs. However, this time Yoshihiro Sakaguchi wasn't in the hot seat. He was still tasked with a lot of the sound design, but the job of main composer fell on a relative unknown. Yoko Shimomura joined Capcom the year I was born, 1988. She was a member of Capcom's internal sound team, Alph Lyla, where she helped arrange tracks for the Japan-only horror title Sweet Home, and even contributed some compositions to the Yoshihiro Sakaguchi-led score of Final Fight, itself a quasi-spin-off/sequel to Street Fighter I. In the 21st century, Yoko Shimomura is indisputably regarded as one of the greatest game composers of our time, but back in the time of Street Fighter II, you'd be damn lucky if you could even find out her name. Heck, good luck knowing the name of anyone who worked on these games. In Japanese game credits at the time, it was extremely common practice for the developers to use aliases instead of their real names. Heck, Yoshihiro Sakaguchi, the Street Fighter I composer, is probably better known to this day under his then alias, Yuki-chan's Papa. This custom was largely due to the companies making the games not wanting their precious, overworked staff from being poached by other companies. As paranoid as this might seem, there was a lot of headhunting happening at the time. In Matt Leone's fantastic Like a Hurricane, an unofficial oral history of Street Fighter II, a few old Capcom devs speculated that the long history between Capcom and SNK, the company responsible for some of Street Fighter's biggest competitors like Fatal Fury and King of Fighters, began when Capcom poached the composer Harumi Fujita from SNK. So yeah, this stuff was serious. But you can't headhunt a head without a real name attached to it, hence the proliferation of aliases at the time. And the use of aliases applied to the folks in Alph Lyla as well, including Yoko Shimomura, who at the time went by several aliases, such as P, Shimo-P, and even Oimono Yo-chan. And so it's this mysterious P, who several years into her career at Capcom, hits on her biggest break yet. Originally released for arcades in March 1991, Street Fighter II introduced the world to 8 playable characters, all of which would remain staples of the series to this day. Giving each character their own identifiable theme song was a crucial part of the game's success, and here, Capcom really hit the jackpot. Tasked with conveying the identities of this very diverse spread of characters, Yoko Shimomura followed the template established in the first Street Fighter of leaning on their nationalities and cultures. Or at least the image of those cultures. The beating heart of Street Fighter's representation of various ethnicities and cultures is one based less on reality and more on ideals. Or, if you're feeling less charitable, caricatures and stereotypes. From the vodka-loving hyper-patriotic Russian wrestler to the Indian yoga master, subtlety is perhaps not the first adjective I would use to describe Street Fighter II's original characters. But while caricatures are often used to promote negative stereotypes, there's a certain earnestness, however misguided, at trying to convey an idealization of something bigger, maybe even warmer, than reality. In a 2014 interview with Red Bull Music Academy, Shimomura touches on this tension. When we were discussing the type of songs I should make, there were different scenes from different countries, but I thought, the real India isn't like this. It's the same way that Japan is geisha and kabuki from the eyes of foreigners. That kind of mysterious, distorted view of the world was funny to me. For example, for India, I wouldn't make real Indian music, but I'd make what I imagined Indian music to be like. She's touching at a hyper-reality at the core of every Street Fighter character. Street Fighter 2's character themes are stand-ins for characters that are, in turn, stand-ins for idealized countries and cultures. It's a heavy weight to bear for a character, let alone the real woman composing these tracks, but across the Street Fighter 2 soundtrack, Shimomura deftly bestows upon its characters highly melodic and memorable themes that nail the tension of evoking the individual fighters, as well as the idealized or imagined versions of their countries. And it's from this same cloth that Chun-Li was made. With her streamlined traditional kipao dress and her ox horn hairstyle, Chun-Li embodies a romanticized image of 20th century Chinese culture based partially on reality, as well as this more pernicious hyper-reality. And that balance is also true of her musical theme. Within the opening few bars, the music tells us so much about Chun-Li's character. The opening short and fast synth tones are delicate, evoking the character's beauty, but they are also wicked fast and precise, bringing to mind her most iconic of special moves, her flurry of lightning kicks known as Gyakuretsu Kyaku. The opening bars, nay, the opening seconds, also convey so much of the character's nationality. This fast-moving opening melody, along with the subsequent main melody, are both derived from the pentatonic scale. As the name implies, the pentatonic scale involves just 5 notes per octave. Because most of Western music is built around 7-note scales, the pentatonic scale, by comparison, can seem to our baby ears pretty claustrophobic, limiting, and lacking tension. The sentiment that music based around pentatonic scales is a bit, well, boring, is not one that I share, but it is a common one. As such, it becomes easy for the nuances and complexities of various pentatonic scales to be lost. It also means that discussions around music from cultures with extensive use of pentatonic scales are often oversimplified and reductive. Chinese music history goes back thousands and thousands of years and is incredibly rich and beautifully diverse, but because a lot of it is built around various pentatonic scales, it's led Western music to develop its own shorthand musical language to evoke China, or Japan, or sometimes all of Asia. Over the last 2 centuries, there are countless examples of this musical stereotyping, such as variations of the quote-unquote Oriental riff, used in plays, operas, classical music, pop music, and, of course, video games. And with the dominant influence of Western music on post-war Japan, we start seeing Japanese video game composers themselves starting to use the Oriental riff in their own compositions when they need to evoke China or Chinese-coded lands and characters. To paraphrase Shimomura's quote from earlier, it's not evoking real Chinese music, it's what we imagine Chinese music to sound like. Which finally brings us back to Chun-Li's theme. Mercifully, the opening of her theme isn't just a verbatim take on the Oriental riff, but it's working from that same Western cultural osmosis to instantly evoke our image of Chinese music. In the liner notes to Brave Wave's definitive release of the Street Fighter II soundtrack, Shimomura describes Chun-Li's theme as, from a Japanese perspective, stereotypically Chinese. Inversely, for the Japanese sumo wrestler E. Honda, her approach was the opposite. What do non-Japanese think Japanese music sounds like? Of course, the sadder irony here is that, with both tracks opening with quite similar pentatonic scale riffs, the distinction between the 2 tracks' cultural identities is likely lost on most Western listeners. The opening 16th note speed synth line, along with the main verse's catchy melody line, are the two quintessential pieces to Chun-Li's theme. It's also worth noting that Shimomura creates the illusion of just using the pentatonic scale, but in fact allows herself access to broader ranges of notes throughout. For example, that main melody frequently steps outside the scale to add tension. There's a lot more to it than that though. The crunchy bass line doubles the intro melody, and the kick, snare, and hi-hat give the track that high energy momentum that's nearly mandatory in any fighting game track. For verse 2, the main melody catches up to the rhythm of the faster synth and beautifully harmonizes it. The underlying slapped bass line and implied chords similarly become more plaintive and soulful, which makes for a more complex and textured soundscape. The track is more than long enough to last an average round of Street Fighter without having to loop, but not content with writing some of the most identifiable themes in video game history, Yoko Shimomura was also a pioneer in dynamic or adaptive music. To heighten the tension of the battle, once one of the fighters' health drops to about 30%, the music switches to a much faster, tension-fueled arrangement. This sped-up arrangement exclusively repeats the opening bars of the original version, but after every second loop, it moves up a semitone, creating this rising sensation that ramps up the intensity and desperation in the final moments of the match. It's a nice touch, and obviously it applies to not just Chun-Li's theme, but all of the fighters' themes. It was Shimomura who suggested implementing this feature in the game. And while having the music speed up at key moments in a game wasn't particularly novel, take for example 1985 Super Mario Bros., which had the music speed up once you started running out of time, having the trigger tied to a more dynamic variable like a health bar, and having the resulting music not just be a sped up version of what you've heard before, but a new arrangement entirely, means Street Fighter II's innovative implementation of the idea is well worth highlighting and celebrating. While Yoko Shimomura wrote the vast majority of tracks for Street Fighter II, she wasn't alone. Isao Abe, aka Oyaji, another Alph Lyla staple, wrote a few of the in-between jingles, such as the Versus screen and Here Comes a New Challenger. He also wrote Sagat's devilishly wonderful character theme, especially remarkable for its odd 11/8 time signature. So cool. The first few iterations of Street Fighter II were made using the CP system, an arcade system board developed by Capcom. But by 1993, Capcom had prepped the CP System 2 JAMA, or CPS2, which allowed for more colors and better sound output than its predecessor. To mark the occasion, Capcom developed Super Street Fighter II, The New Challengers, on the CPS2 and took the opportunity to remake just about every audio and visual element from the game. This included the soundtrack, which follows the CPS1 versions to a T, but with much richer and evocative synthesized instruments. Whether it sounds better or simply different is too contentious a topic for me to wade into, but it can certainly be said that the new CPS2 mixes were brighter, wider, with a bit more edge. Those synthesized, chugging guitar sounds definitely had more bite than on the CPS1. But by 1993, Yoko Shimomura had left Capcom for Square, where she would go on to score stone-cold classics such as Live Alive, Parasite Eve, and a little something called Kingdom Hearts. She wasn't involved with these new CPS2 arrangements of the Street Fighter II themes. Instead, these were done by returning composer Isao Abe and first-timer Shun Nishigaki, aka Shun. Even though this was Nishigaki's first involvement with the SF series, his contributions shouldn't be understated. Nishigaki was involved with the majority of the new CPS2 arrangements, along with writing new ending tracks for several of the characters, including Chun-Li's. The titular new challengers in Super Street Fighter II were 4 new characters that joined the roster. Abe was in charge of DJ and T-Hawk's themes, while Nishigaki composed Fei Long's and, my personal favorite Street Fighter II era theme, Kami's theme. Abe and Nishigaki are fantastic torchbearers of Street Fighter II's sound legacy, to the point where many of their individual accomplishments often get wrapped up or incorrectly attributed to Yoko Shimomura. While there is absolutely no question that she was Street Fighter II's main composer, this monumental and historic score is still the work of not just 1, but 3 people. But you didn't have to read the tea leaves to predict Street Fighter II's lasting legacy. In no time at all, it had already become a pop culture phenomenon, with TV series, comics, trading cards, action figures, and even a few movies.
Of course!
While the original game soundtracks held less sway and influence over this vast web of merchandising and spin-offs, you can at least still hear a bit of Chun-Li's theme in the better of the 2 1994 Street Fighter movies. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one of the most crucial factors in Street Fighter II's worldwide dominance: the home console versions.
Here we go!
Both the Super Nintendo and eventually the Sega Genesis received several hugely successful, multi-million copies selling ports of Street Fighter II. With how powerful home consoles have become over the last couple of decades, it's easy to forget that there was a time when arcades were where you went for the most cutting-edge audio-visual experiences. Back then, the technological differences between an arcade cabinet the size of a fridge that cost thousands of dollars and a more modest $200 home console were steep, and this was true of the arcade and console versions of Street Fighter II as well. Porting the game to consoles required a lot of work, and the same was true of the game's sound. The music arrangers on those projects were constrained in terms of quality and quantity of sounds available to them. As Shimomura put it, the goal was to maintain the original feel of the arcade tracks, while reducing the number of elements in each song so they would still fit the new hardware requirements. The sound programmers on both the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis versions did admirable jobs with the transition, and while they lack a bit of the arcade version's impact, they get the job done. For little nerds like me too intimidated to go to arcades in the 90s, the console versions of the soundtrack were the only ones I ever heard growing up. From the impressive 4-channel demake of the Game Boy version, to the limitless freedom of the latest Nintendo Switch version, Capcom will likely never tire of remaking Street Fighter II and its iconic soundtrack. And I think part of the reason why is because it allows the rest of the series to evolve on its own terms, unshackled from the expectations of its sophomore juggernaut. With Street Fighter just about at the top of the world, it seemed about time for a proper sequel to 2. But it wasn't Street Fighter 3. Instead, Capcom gave us a prequel taking place between Street Fighter 1 and 2.
Street Fighter Alpha.
Street Fighter Alpha, Warrior's Dream, or simply Street Fighter Zero depending on where you played it, was released to arcades, PlayStation 1, and the Sega Saturn, giving the world a familiar but fresh new spin on the Street Fighter series, and the same was true of its soundtrack. On the sound team, Isao Abe and Shun Nishigaki returned, bolstered by 4 additional members of the Capcom sound team Alpha Lyla. Street Fighter Alpha's cast was comprised of a mix of characters from Street Fighter 1, 2, Final Fight, and a few brand new characters. The characters without pre-existing themes received new compositions for Alpha, while the others were privy to new, lush arrangements of their Street Fighter II era themes. In the case of Chun-Li, her Shimomura-composed theme was remade by Naoshi Groovy Mizuta. And as his nickname implies, Mizuta's arrangement of Chun-Li's theme is... it's groovy, man. This is unmistakably Chun-Li's theme, but Mizuta is packing funk and J-pop this time around. The Chinese coded riff is slowed down and broken up on a synth that's not aiming to sound like anything other than a synth. This ends up being the same instruments that plays Chun-Li's primary leitmotif, which sounds very accurate to the original. Less accurate and more inspired are all the new jazz chords Mizuta throws underneath the winding melody. This more energetic chord progression is way livelier than the original, giving the track so much more bounce. And it's not just the stankier jazz chords, it's also the frequency of chord changes that skyrockets. In the original version, the chord changes are mostly implied by the fast arpeggiated synths and bass line, while in the Alpha version, the quasi-funk guitar/xylophone are explicitly playing chords, making the changes not just more obvious, but more engaging. So even though the overall BPM of the two tracks is fairly close together, the frequency of chord changes imparts Mizuta's version with a constant sense of groovy movement. This is easily my favorite arrangement of Chun-Li's Shimomura era theme. But while the main section's chord progression gets an inspired glow-up, the segmentation of the overall track has been simplified, a bit too much so if you ask me. Beyond this catchy main segment, there just isn't much else there. Shimomura's original introduced a lot of melodic variety in the second verse, leading to an overall more dynamic and evolving track. Mizuta's second verse, however, is a bit of an inversion of this. Instead of changing the melody around, it repeats the one from the first verse verbatim while introducing new variations to the underlying chord progression. It makes for fun embellishments, but ultimately has a bit less to say than the original. Also, thanks to the all-encompassing data storage power of CD-ROM technology, Capcom provided an additional, higher fidelity version of the Street Fighter Alpha soundtrack for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn versions of the game. These arrangements were based on the arcade versions, but allowed for much more bandwidth on its use of sampled instruments. Naoshi Mizuta returned to help score this remixed version of the score, and yeah, it sounds damn good as well. To this day, this is some very high-quality sounding music. In my video on Shoji Megudo's career, I discussed his frustration around the bandwidth limitations of CD-ROMs, since by the time developers had finished cramming the disc with polygonal characters, environments, and chunky pre-rendered videos, there wasn't always that much space left for high-resolution sounds. Sounds you usually associate with CD-quality music. But since 2D game assets typically have much smaller footprints than 3D ones, the Street Fighter Alpha sound team didn't have to worry as much as Megudo, or the other PS1-era greats working on 3D games, about having to compromise on sound quality and bitrate. Meaning the console-arranged version of the Street Fighter Alpha soundtrack sounds markedly higher quality than a lot of the video game music usually associated with 5th-generation consoles. This glossier, more realistic console arrangement would have been an opportunity to sub that synth with a more Chinese-sounding instrument, were that the intention of the arranger. But clearly, it wasn't. And this is true of just about the entire Alpha soundtrack, which in stark defiance of Street Fighter 1 and 2's legacy, doesn't lean as much into the musical instrument stereotyping for its character themes, giving the score a more uniform and funky vibe. The only time Alpha actually leans into the overtly quote-unquote ethnic instrumentation is for Sodom's theme. Here we get Japanese instrument accents in the form of a shamisen and a shakuhachi. But if you're not familiar with the character, Sodom isn't Japanese. He's just an American weeb who wears a samurai mask. So the use of traditional Japanese instrumentation here is pretty subversive, especially in the context of the Street Fighter series. The next year, Capcom released a sort of do-over on Street Fighter Alpha in the form of Street Fighter Alpha 2. The Alpha 1 soundtrack is largely left intact, although it required some new compositions and arrangements for the new and returning characters. Another funny quirk of Alpha 2 is that, unlike Alpha 1, it also got ported to the Super Nintendo. But that last-gen console couldn't quite handle the complexity of the arcade version soundtrack, and definitely couldn't even begin to touch the super high-resolution PS1 and Saturn remix soundtrack. But the SNES downsampled / demake version of the Alpha score is still an interesting beast. Afterward, this is where we say goodbye to Naoshi Mizuta's work on Street Fighter. Like Yoko Shimomura before him, Naoshi Mizuta would leave Capcom a few years later to join Square, now called Squaresoft, where history would repeat itself. Mizuta would find himself once again arranging Shimomura compositions in 1999's Parasite Eve 2. He would find even more acclaim as Final Fantasy XI's post-launch lead composer, as well as being one of the 3 composers on one of my personal favorite soundtracks of all time, Final Fantasy XIII-2. Mizuta's Street Fighter legacy isn't as celebrated as the SF2 composers, but beyond just his fantastic arrangements, his original Alpha compositions are also worthy of the highest praise. His composition for the joke character Dan Hibiki is, unironically, my favorite Alpha-era character theme. I don't often think of Mizuta and Street Fighter in the same sentence, but yeah, his work on the series shouldn't be slept on. At this point, there's a bit of a split in the Street Fighter timeline. 1996 also saw the release of 2 new major Street Fighter spin-off series.
Street Fighter EX!
The Street Fighter EX series was an experimental foray into the world of 3D graphics that introduced a colorful cast of new characters, along with returning favorites, such as Chun-Li. In what will soon become a trend for the main series as well, these returning characters were treated to all new theme songs, not just rearrangements of their pre-existing tracks. The more successful Versus series, on the other hand, introduced a more dramatic departure from the grounded 1v1 formula of the main Street Fighter series, but the music themes for the returning characters were more identifiably related to their prior incarnations. Chun-Li's theme in particular has a virtual guitar shredding new melody lines above a familiar foundation. There are many more ports, remakes, and spin-offs of the Street Fighter series that are worth exploring, but for this video's sake, I'm going to try my best to stick to the mainline titles. My sincerest apologies to Super Puzzle Fighter. Anyway. While Capcom was prepping a third iteration of Alpha, they were also cooking up a proper sequel to the Alpha series. 1997's Street Fighter III New Generation was a radical evolution of the Street Fighter series. This was Capcom's prized horse to show off the CP System 3, their latest and greatest arcade system board. The end result is, for my money, to this day the most beautifully animated video game of all time. And paired with its luscious animations was a completely new sound for the series. The jazz and funk outbursts of the Alpha score are cranked up to 11, paired with hip-hop production and burgeoning future-forward EDM subgenres. The score was co-composed by just two people, a more intimate setup than the Alpha series scores, and more akin to how Street Fighter II was made. Yuki Iwai was a member of the Capcom sound team and had previously worked on games such as the Mega Man X series and Final Fight 2. For SF3, she is primarily responsible for the various interstitial tracks, such as the opening video, character select, and several of the ending sequences. She also scored about half of the stage themes, although personally, most of these did not leave as lasting an impression as the ones made by the beating heart of Street Fighter III's sound, Hideki Okugawa. Okugawa had worked on several Capcom games prior to SF3, notably composing several themes for the first two Darkstalkers games. With New Generation, Okugawa comes out swinging with several Street Fighter all-timers, such as the first iteration of future classic Jazzy NYC. I mean, what can you say about this one? From the, say it with me, jazzy, cymbals-led drum beat, to the sample-heavy aesthetics of hip-hop production, to the wonderfully catchy saxophone lead melody, and the, in my opinion, greatest chord progression in all of video games. It's a certified classic. But look at that track name, Jazzy NYC. Or even its full name, Jazzy NYC Underground Edit Stage New York 1. Yeah, that's a mouthful. That's a lot of words, but none of those are a character's name. However, New York City is newcomer and SF3 mascot Alex's stage. So is it Alex's theme? Well, if you've played any subsequent game featuring Alex, you'll know that, yeah, Jazzy NYC is absolutely his theme. But in Street Fighter 3? Not so much. Case in point, there's a second version of Jazzy NYC called Jazzy NYC Street Edit that functions as the character Sean's stage. As such, both Alex, Sean, and New York City have equal claims to the composition. This is a bit of a full circle moment for the series, since, if you recall, the is it a character theme, is it a stage theme tension was present all the way back in Street Fighter 1. And that same dilemma is true of every stage/character theme in Street Fighter 3. For example, in the case of Chun-Li's stage, Wait a minute, where's Chun-Li? Hang on. They didn't put Chun-Li in Street Fighter 3? I mean, Ryu and Ken made it in, but their iconic Shimomura themes didn't make it either? And come to think of it, who the hell are the rest of these guys? Well, Street Fighter III's subtitle wasn't messing around. This is a whole new generation of fighters, meaning this was goodbye to a dozen of the most iconic characters in video game history. If this seems like a strange way for Capcom to approach the first proper sequel to Street Fighter II, then it's worth pointing out that this game didn't start as Street Fighter III. This was going to be its own unique fighting game series, before at some point pivoting into an actual Street Fighter game. Hence there only being two familiar faces. Hence a weirdo like Alex is the main character. Hence Oro being Oro. Perhaps somewhat unsurprisingly, New Generation was not as warmly received as Alpha and 2's debuts. So, Capcom would attempt to massage things by releasing to arcades a second version of Street Fighter III later that same year. For players missing familiar faces, Second Impact brings back Akuma, but also doubles down on the unknown new faces, with the introduction of 2 new big buff dudes. Second Impact added new mechanics such as EX specials, but also gave the entire soundtrack a refresh. Okugawa and Iwai returned for the job, mostly continuing where New Generation left off. The Second Impact score is largely remixed versions of the New Generation themes. Jazzy NYC gets a 3rd remix, this time called Jazzy NYC New House Mix. This version feels a bit lackluster to me since the fantastic jazz chord progression has been simplified. But on the plus side, it becomes easier to associate the track with just Alex and not Sean. Sean instead gets his own separate theme, named after his own unique stage, naturally. As much as I adore the New Generation and Second Impact scores, I can imagine the alienating sentiment that pervaded many of the players at the time was pretty overwhelming. Street Fighter III was very, very different. The disorienting lack of recognizable character themes from 2 and Alpha was just the cherry on top. Perhaps anticipating some of the backlash, Capcom launched Street Fighter Alpha 3 the following year. But if Street Fighter III's big musical swerve upset or scared you, then I'm afraid Alpha 3 would likely provide you little comfort. To the great surprise of many, Capcom decided to completely remake the entire Alpha series soundtrack. All the menus, all the endings, and yes, all of the character themes. And we're not just talking about new arrangements of the classic tunes. Alpha 3's 5 composers created all new compositions for the entire Alpha 3 cast, which also added several more characters to the already massive roster. The workload on this project is fairly evenly split between Yuki Iwai, her husband Takayuki Iwai, and Isao Abe. Okugawa, still very much busy with the Street Fighter III series, only has the time to contribute a handful of tunes. And finally, Tetsuya Shibata, a relative unknown at this point, but soon to become one of Capcom's most prolific composers, rounded out the group of composers. It also completed the trend started with Street Fighter III of radically rejecting Street Fighter II's motivic legacy. All those old themes are gone. Musically, this is arguably the most drastic change in Street Fighter history. Yes, Street Fighter III's shift was pretty dramatic too, but Okugawa's jazz-rich score was a logical next step from Alpha 1 and 2. Alpha 3, on the other hand, was a deliberate rejection of that increasingly jazzy, hip sound of the series towards a colder, more techno-industrial influence, doubling down on an absolute reverence for chunky, grinding synths, thumping kick drums, and tinier electronic beats and fat 80s-style reverb snares. Let's look at Yuki Iwai's new theme for Chun-Li, Resolution. There are a few surface-level similarities to her prior theme, but this is otherwise a completely new take on how to musically represent Chun-Li. Like Shimomura's SF2 composition, Iwai's opens with short, fast, pointed synth stabs. We then move to a main synth melody which, again, doesn't explicitly reference the Street Fighter II track, but functions as the piece's main melody. It's evocative of the original track without really leaning so much on the quote-unquote Chinese-coded musical flourishes. I think this is a good thing. The next part is fairly groovy, with bigger emphasis on the kick drum and some late 90s echoey synths. It feels as if you're watching a straight-to-VHS hacking movie or something. Hell yeah. Afterward, well, that's about it. The track loops. Like with Alpha 1 and 2, there's no manic critical variant that triggers when you're low on health. So, yeah, that's it. Personally, I find the Alpha 3 score the hardest to go back to. The complete rejection of the series' motivic legacy is admirably punk rock, but I don't think any of the replacement character themes come even close to matching their Street Fighter II and Alpha counterparts. Honorable mention must go to Isao Abe's new Sagat theme, at least, whose odd tempo and gnarly bassline wonderfully captures the essence of his original Street Fighter II theme. This feels very appropriate since Abe wrote both versions of Sagat's theme. But overall, its earnest, lo-fi, grimy techno also feels sandwiched between two different musical eras, both of which have had successful nostalgic revivals. To its left, we have the chiptune and simpler retro-sounding synths of Street Fighter II and the prior Alpha games. To its right, we have Street Fighter III saliently tapping into niche subgenres of electronica, some real proto-Y2K aesthetic stuff. Two styles of music which have had widespread resurgence and reappraisal, but that same resurgence hasn't quite happened for the type of techno Alpha 3 basks in. Its own time will come, eventually, but I don't think we're quite there yet. As for Yuki Iwai, her post-Street Fighter career isn't as illustrious as Yoko Shimomura or Naoshi Mizuta's, although she did help score one game at Squaresoft, now called Square Enix, Musashi Samurai Legend. She also worked on a few games in the shmup series R-Type, which, in my opinion, better matches her style than Street Fighter Alpha 3. But as the world enjoyed this third iteration of Street Fighter Alpha, Capcom was also readying a third and final version of Street Fighter 3. On the eve of the millennium, Capcom launched the culmination of everything they'd learned developing fighting games in the shape of Street Fighter III Third Strike, one of the finest video games of all time. And not content with just being a stone-cold classic, its all-new original soundtrack is just as iconic.
The third strike, y'all, is Street Fighter 3.
The jazzy hip-hop ideations of New Generation and Second Impact are now front and center, resulting in a singular score that expertly navigates a plethora of dance music subgenres, such as clubbing, house, jungle, and breakbeat. So much breakbeat. Like with Second Impact, the score is part remix album, part something entirely new. Alex and Ken stage, Jazzy NYC 99, is the final and most iconic version of Jazzy NYC, often regarded as one of the greatest pieces in Street Fighter history. As that track title implies, we've returned to some of the ambiguities of New Generation as to who the theme really belongs to. So is it Alex and Ken now? What about Sean? Well, Sean now shares a theme with Oro. Keep up, will you? Third Strike's soundtrack was composed entirely by Hideki Okugawa. This is the first time since Street Fighter 1 that there's only one composer attached to the project. And this comes through in the score's unified vision. Okugawa gets all the limelight. Well, almost all the limelight. To further elevate Third Strike's hip-hop inspired, sample-heavy vibe, Capcom employed Toronto rapper Infinite to write some bars in several of Okugawa's key tracks, such as the intro and character select screen. Not only that, Infinite doubles as the in-battle announcer.
Prepare to strike, now!
For perhaps the first time in the series' history, Capcom's finally putting emphasis on what's been implied since the get-go. They finally put the street in Street Fighter. Oh, and Chun-Li? Yeah, she's finally back. Hideki Okugawa's China Vox is Chun-Li's third theme to date. It has the unmistakable breakbeat-style percussion prevalent in most of this soundtrack, but it also has a fairly Chun-Li-esque repeating melody line in the intro. This is fairly consistent with how Shimomura and Iwai opened their Chun-Li themes. There's no motivic overlap between the three intros, but each one emphasizes fast, clearly defined individual notes in a repetitive manner. You know what I mean? Yes? Sorta? Maybe? No? Okay, yeah, maybe not so much. For as much as I adore the Third Strike soundtrack, the distinctiveness and individuality of the character themes at times plays second fiddle to the arguably just as admirable objective of tonal consistency and cohesion. But Street Fighter III was an inherently radical leap in the Street Fighter series, and so it seems fair that Third Strike, the ultimate expression of Street Fighter III, would too rustle some feathers. Another Third Strike innovation is the use of unique per-round music. Instead of having the music continue on, or simply loop and restart, for round 2, the game loads up a second arrangement of the stage theme you're on. In the case of China Vox, the first round's main melody, if you can even call it that, has largely taken a bow at this point, leading to more of an instrumental jam. This does a great job of differentiating the feel of the first round from the second. In other cases, the effect is more pronounced. Twilight, Ibuki's theme, is one of my favorite tracks from Third Strike. It does a fantastic job evoking the young ninja's sneaky covert ops thanks to groovy chords and a mysterious flute line. But once we reach the second round, and we've gotten a better look and feel for the character's teenage antics, the track changes to something more approachable, with more emotion in plain sight. But it's still unmistakably Twilight, allowing us to quickly intuit two sides of the character. Having the music dynamically change on a per-round basis is a very cool idea that would eventually become a series staple, but not right away. Like with many things involving Street Fighter III, it was easy to take its innovations for granted. This was 1999, and 3D games had infinitely more cachet than 2D ones. 3D fighters like Tekken, Virtua Fighter, and Soul Calibur might look a little dated in the third decade of the 21st century, but back in the day, those were the new hotness and ran laps around just another 2D Street Fighter game. As a game to close out Capcom's 20th century legacy, Third Strike is an enigmatic note to end on. The pinnacle of 2D animation, the undisputed king of 2D fighting game design, a transcendent soundtrack that successfully steps out of Street Fighter II's tall shadow. But all to what end? Capcom had largely reclaimed their title of Arcade King in a world that was gravitating more and more towards console games, console experiences. It also meant that Third Strike coming to consoles, in this case the Sega Dreamcast, did not have the seismic cultural impact akin to when Street Fighter II launched on consoles. But on the plus side, like with Alpha 1 on the original PlayStation, when Third Strike came to the Dreamcast, it received an optional, brand new arrangement of the score. On paper, that might seem a bit sacrilegious, but in practice, it's a fairly faithful arrangement, but with substantially higher fidelity sounds. In a blind test, you'd be hard not to select this one as a net improvement, although I'm still partial to the compromised bitrate of the arcade original. Following Third Strike, Okugawa would go on to score several other high-profile series at Capcom, including Onimusha, Dead Rising, and Resident Evil, which all sound completely different from Street Fighter III and show just how massive his range is. But his involvement with the Street Fighter series began and ended with the SF3 trilogy. Like with Naoshi Mizuta, it's a very narrow slice of Street Fighter history, but boy is it a tasty one. So far, we've looked at 4 main iterations of Chun-Li's theme, each one a microcosm of Street Fighter's musical evolution at that point in time. From Yoko Shimomura's foundational composition that blended exaggerations of character and culture with approachable, highly melodic melody and harmony work, to Naoshi Mizuta transforming the composition into a more youthful, jazz fusion sound, to Yuki Iwai's radical rejection of the series' motivic legacy, and finally rounding it out with Okugawa doubling down on Iwai's ambitions, charting a new confident path forward for the series. A new millennium would bring with it big new challenges for Street Fighter, but that's a story for another time. Currently, I am about halfway through writing the script for part 2, but I'm gonna need your help to get it to the finish line. My YouTube channel is still very small, and these videos take a very, very long time to make. If you can, please give the video a like and leave a comment. Those help out so much when it comes to getting the video in front of more eyeballs. If you're not sure what to write in the comments, tell me what your favorite character theme from Street Fighter II's 2D era is. I'd love to know. Also, if you know anyone or any message board, subreddit, or Discord that would enjoy this video, I'd be extremely grateful if you could share it widely. If this video finds an audience and resonates with folks, I'll do what I can to get part 2 out as soon as possible. But of course, nothing helps out more than the mighty fine folks over on my Patreon who are keeping this channel afloat. These videos would be impossible to make without your help, and I would be so grateful to have you aboard. Okay, that's it for now. Take care. Bye.